Alright, so this week, I'm going to be practicing shading on forms, basic forms, nothing complex, because this is what I'm learning. So I'm still very much in this beginner stage of learning shading, which is why I'm doing this now, obviously. So I have a couple resources here about shading forms. First is this video from Monica Zagrobelna. I believe her name is pronounced that way. As always, include this in the description, of course. She goes over it. I looked around. This is a really good, quick kind of crash course in understanding shading and how light and stuff works with objects with basic forms. I've looked around, and most of the stuff I could find on this is really complicated. So this is a really good resource because it's not super complicated. And then there's also this reference pack that's free if you want it, of actual basic forms that you can reference to draw from, which I would suggest you do because it's free. And it's good to have a realistic look at what things actually look like. And it's good to have a mix of drawing from imagination and drawing from reference. So, let's draw some forms. Start off with, oops. Okay. So let's start off with a basic, or with a actual reference. So that's always good to start off with. Basic forms, let's choose an easy one. If I can find, there we go, here's an easy one. So, we have a triangle, or not triangle, a cone here. And we're going to look at how light works and how we would draw it and stuff. So first, we're going to just have a line work layer. And just create this shape I need. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the reference. Just something that you can learn from. Alright. So, as we can see in this, there's many different types of there's different rules for lighting and how it works in the real world from what I've been learning. And you have to take it step by step. Otherwise it's way too complicated to try and do it all at once when you're a beginner. So, with your line work of whatever basic shape you're doing, and we'll do some from imagination after this as well. I don't know, put my background color to something darker, similar to what the reference image has. And I'm going to draw over this. Wait, why don't I just do this? Take a value. I'm going to take something sort of a mid-tone, like that. Ought to work. Fill that in. So the first thing that I think is the easiest thing to do is to look at your object establish a light source. Since we're using a reference, we have a light source already that's coming from here, so it's coming from this direction, obviously above it, and casting the shadow. So the first thing I'm going to do is find the cast shadow and the terminator, which is the edge of your form where the light cannot touch it because it's from the directional light. The directional light can't see that side, so that's called the terminator, where the light stops because it can't see that. So the terminator, whoops, you have something a little darker. And the terminator and your cast shadow have the same value at first before you add anything else, which we will add later. So my terminator looks to be about there, and I'm just adding harsh lines right now. This is a more, because this object is round, you can see how there's a slight blending of values there. It's not a hard edge. Let me turn this into a clip mask. So there's my terminator right here. Whoops. This is my terminator, which is this line where the light cannot, the light source, which is going there. The heck? Oh, can't even see it. There we go. Move that over. Sorry about that. So you have the light source, which is this guy here, is going forward and hitting that. And this is the edge here where the light cannot see because it's angled, it's at an angle where this edge here, which I guess I already explained, is where the light doesn't hit anymore. Now the cast shadow, so we have a ground plane underneath this, which we will, whoops, pretend exists here, and cast shadow just go off into the distance, like from my reference here. Goes up a little, whoops. And again, it'll be the same value at first before we add any reflected light. Let's say that, and again, I'm just doing harsh shadows here because we can soften them up later. The other edge is probably about right there. Oops. So that's our cast shadow. That's very basic lighting right here. Next, what I would do is add in the highlight, which will be right there, because the highlight is the piece of your form that is directly facing the light source. I'll use a soft brush for this too, just because it's a little easier to shade it in the clip mask. So this is where the light is directly touching or looking at. This is the part of the form that's directly facing the light because it's receiving the most light. There's a really good analogy I heard about this here. I'll try to illustrate it. That goes like, so say you have 3 planes like this, and you have your light source, which is shining down like that. Whichever way the plane is facing, so this one's facing that way, that one's facing that way, this one's facing that way. Since this one is directly facing the direction of the light source, it's going to get the most light. So this will be our brightest plane. It will receive full intensity of the light. And these ones will receive slightly less intensity of the light. So this one would be pure white, or not necessarily pure white, but the brightest. These other two would be a little, not quite that much, but be a little bit less than white. little bit less than the brightest intensity because they're slightly off, slightly not facing the main light source, so they're receiving less light. So back to this. I hope that makes sense. And so looking at our reference, like again, this isn't perfect, but it's close enough. Going to just draw that line, that part of the form, that edge of the form where the light is brightest. Oops. And this piece of the light, oops, this edge here is directly facing the light, and since it's a round object, like we had those other planes, they're moving around. So every slice of this object is slowly getting less and less light as it goes around. So you can kind of shade or even that out. Soften it, the transition like a gradient. Oops, what is this? Wrong layer. So, where's this? So I'm going to soften this. Go back to bright white. And we'll transition this out. Something like that. Again, it's not perfect. I'm going to clean this up over here. And now let's get that. If you had a really, like, for example, the sun on a cloudless day, you'd have lighting like this where there's really harsh shadows. But this, on their reference, is like a more cloudy day where there's more diffused light. So the shadows will be a little softer. With exception to, of course, this edge. Because it's a round form, it would be, even with harsh lighting, a little gradiented. So we'll do that. Oops. Excuse me. This is very rough, but I'm trying to make my example before I run out of time here because I got to go soon. But so it'd be something like that. It's sort of similar to our reference. I'd say this needs to be a little brighter in that area. But we'll move on to the back shadow here and soften those. Actually, we're not going to soften those edges. We'll just pretend this is a harsh light for the sake of time. Oops. No, wrong. Merge that. Let me put this underneath. Merge that. Okay. So now we can take. So now we have our highlight and we have our cast shadow and our terminator. The next step is, there's two more steps. First one being reflected light. So light from the sun, or whatever your light source, bounces and is hitting the ground plane, and it's bouncing around in all directions. And some of that light will bounce back and hit the form. So it'll be a little bit of reflected light because the sun's hitting all of these spots all around. And they're all bouncing all over the place, some of which hits back at the back of that form. So, to represent that, we will select another clipping mask, take some light, grab a soft brush, and we'll just spread a little bit of light in the shadows here, just like in our reference photo. And I'll clean this edge up here because the light doesn't reflect into, well, light can reflect into the cast shadow, but it's not as noticeable, I suppose, at least in this reference photo from my understanding. That's good enough. Okay. So now you can see there's a little bit of, whoops, it's a little bit of light casting in there, like we see here, and it brightens up the back of that a little, which makes it stand out a little from the shadow. The last step would be adding an occlusion shadow, which, as you can see, the very bottom here, this cone. Oh, it's really dark right there, and there's this slight darkness down at the edge where it's touching the base of this plane or this table. And that's because what you have is, see if I can try to illustrate this again. What you have is an object sitting on the ground plane. And it's very difficult for light to bounce from the sun. It hits here and then it's bouncing. And it's less likely that it's going to bounce into that very bottom edge because it's such a steep angle. And it's just a lot harder for the light to reach that edge. So you can add, or the last step is to add a occlusion shadow, which for the sake of time, I'll be very quick and hasty about it. Okay, so with our occlusion shadow, we'll just erase that very edge. And now, similar to our reference photo, it's a little bit harsher there. We have that edge, and it really, I think once you add the occlusion shadow, it really helps sell the realism of it. So as you see before, if I take that away, it seems a lot flatter. You add it, it's actually grounded on that plane. So let's move on from this to just a basic form for the sake of time. I'll probably just do let's do a cube. It's very simple, quite difficult, or no, round objects are the most difficult, but say you got a cube from imagination. And we'll also use the knowledge we gained from learning about cast shadows and how to cast those shadows from your light source. So you have this object, or this cube here, and let's say our light source is, so we move this light source, super wonky, whoops, something like that. So because it's at that angle, these two planes will receive the brightest intensity of light versus this edge will not. And it's not quite facing the light exactly, so it won't be super bright like white, but it'll be a little bit less. We go. Let's close that shape. So those two will be, because of the angle, it's hitting those two planes at pretty much the same angle. So they'll be very similar in color. And this plane might be a little darker. Something like that. Excuse me. Now our cast shadow. Which will be similar to that value until we add reflected light. Let's get that direction from our light source. Cast shadow. And add in a little reflected light. Too much. Then an occlusion shadow. And we're pretty solid. Occlusion shadow is the very, very light in the front edge where the light is shining brightest, but a lot darker back where it's not. So yeah, that's the basics of form shading. Out of time, but hopefully I can do a live stream next week where we go into more details. So yeah, that's basics. So go out there and start shading some forms and use that reference pack.